Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, says Rishi Sunak. OK, Prime Minister says at summit in Moldova that there have been very productive discussions on helping Ukraine stand up to Russia. Ukraine's rightful place is within NATO. The Ukraine's rightful place is within NATO, the US. Prime Minister said Thursday, but he stopped short of supporting French calls for an accession roadmap. Speaking to broadcasters after the end of the second summit of the European Political Community, held in Chisinau, Moldova, Rishi Sunak said he had held very productive discussion with European counterparts on irregular migration and how to help Ukraine and Moldova stand up to Russian aggression. Asked if he agreed with French President Emmanuel Macron, who Wednesday called for a clear plan for Ukraine's NATO membership to be discussed next month, Sunak said, "I agree with the NATO Secretary General. Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, but what we are also talking with Ukraine about right now is making sure that they have all the support they need for a successful counteroffensive. Although there's a broad understanding that Ukraine cannot join NATO while the war against Russia continues, Ukraine wants NATO leaders to show political willingness at the NATO summit in Vilnius in July for its eventual accession to NATO. This week, Kyiv intensified its lobbying to get a firm promise from allies. Speaking at the Globsec Security Conference in Slovakia Wednesday, Macron admitted it would be difficult to obtain full consensus within NATO for Ukraine's membership by next month, so instead he called for strong, concrete and tangible security guarantees and a plan for its eventual accession to the transatlantic alliance. "We need something much more substantial and we need a path towards membership," Macron said. Sunak added Ukraine's allies want to make sure that we put in place security arrangements for Ukraine for the long term. So we send a very strong signal for Russian President Vladimir Putin that we are not going anywhere. We are here to stay. We will continue backing Ukraine, not just now, but for years into the future. And he needs to know that, and we will send that signal of support, Sunak said. We hate them even more. Rage and defiance in Kyiv as Russia's attacks increase. Night after night, the people of Kyiv have faced wave after wave of Moscow's missiles and drones, but say the Kremlin's attempts to demoralize them are actually having the opposite effect. "We have only become angrier," 63-year-old pensioner Alla tells Kyiv Post when asked how the people of Kyiv are dealing with a dramatic escalation of Russian missile and drone attacks against the capital. "We hate them even more. The mood is combative. Everyone I speak to has become angrier and more radical-minded. Complete rejection of Muscovites." Alla speaks on a gloriously sunny Wednesday in a park in central Kyiv, where the sight of people strolling amid blossom-laden trees belies the terror that has plagued almost every other nighttime in the capital for a month. A Kyiv Post analysis published on Wednesday found that at least 563 missiles of various categories and Iranian-made Shahed drones that were fired against Ukrainian settlements and territories from the beginning to the end of May. Most of these targeted Kyiv in some 20 attacks. Though the capital's now excellent air defenses shot down over 90%, the incessant sound of explosions and the risks posed by falling debris are disruptive at best, fatal at worst. In the early hours of 1 June, a mother and her 11-year-old daughter lost their lives. "I have grandchildren here," says Alla. "Of course I worry for them, first of all. They are 9 and 11 years old and they get traumatized. They fall asleep during lessons because they don't get enough sleep. Children are psychologically tired, but angrier. One of my grandsons always spoke Russian, and now even when he plays games with his friends, he asks them to speak Ukrainian. But if the Kremlin's aim is to demoralize Kyiv's population, it's actually having the opposite effect. Russians want us to be scared, panicked, to give up," 62-year-old pensioner Hori tells Kyiv Post. "But we are freedom-loving people. We have never had a king, so we will not give up." This sense of defiance is pervasive in all those Kyiv Post spoke to, as the capital bands together in the face of the biggest onslaught from the Kremlin since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. "They can't intimidate us," Natalia says. "All of Kyiv is working. Anton, a 25-year-old entrepreneur, has stayed in Kiev for the duration of the war and says he has developed some kind of immunity, and I do not feel fear. He adds, the day before yesterday when there were explosions, I spent all the time on the balcony watching the war explosions. I spent all the time on the balcony watching the work of air defense. Andriy, a 35-year-old state service worker, admits the constant bombings are not very pleasant, but insists people have adapted to the new reality of this stage of the war. So there is no panic, he says. I just don't like it. The war has been going on for a long time, so people have adapted. We live and move on. The fact Kiev Post is asking how the capital's residents are dealing with just explosions and falling debris and not mass casualties in the hundreds and possibly thousands is due in no small part to the air defenses provided by Ukraine's Western partners, in particular the US-made Patriot system, which has proven itself night after night in Kiev. The Kremlin has been firing its hypersonic Kinzhal missile, touted by Moscow as superior to any NATO long-range strike weapon and able to overcome any air defense system in the world, repeatedly at Kiev, with no success. Kinz hails. Now we catch them too, Natalia tells Kiev Post. They have already done everything they could. What else Russia can throw at Kiev is up for debate, but the feeling that the war is escalating was solidified earlier this week with an unprecedented drone attack on Moscow. Kiev did not claim responsibility for the attack, but the issue of whether Ukraine has the right to strike targets on Russian soil is now top of the international agenda. While the US has hedged its opinion slightly, essentially we don't tell them what to do, just don't use our weapons to do it. The UK and Germany have said such strikes are legitimate. On the streets of Kiev, the latter view is evident in spades. If we hit their faces, they will go away. Another ally tells Kiev Post. Muscovites do not understand another language, so that drone attack on Moscow was fair. We have to defend ourselves, and this is defense. Ahori concurs, saying he is in favor of continuing these attacks. Because the Russian people there are to blame for everything. They live like they are on some other planet. But they must understand what war is, and they must not relax. What happens if NATO makes Ukraine a member shortly after Vilnius summit? Ukrainian membership of NATO is on the agenda at the July summit, but it seems that a Finnish-style fast-track approach is not, in spite of some feeling it should be. What would happen if, hypothetically, NATO decides to make Ukraine a member of the alliance a couple of weeks after the NATO summit in Vilnius on 12 July 2020, 12 July 2023. Just to be clear, I don't expect NATO to take that step, but I strongly believe it would be the smart thing to do. The Ukrainian membership question is on the summit agenda. Fast-track membership, as offered to Finland and Sweden, is presently not seen as an option, though several countries have asked for just that. Both the Estonian Parliament and the Polish Senate adopted statements in support of Ukraine's NATO accession. The Polish senators backed an accelerated accession based on the precedent set for Sweden and Finland. Some member states want to officially put Ukraine on the path to membership. The group of European People's Party, EP Group, called on all NATO members to formally endorse both the Ukrainian peace formula and the Kiev Security Compact recommendations and to actively contribute to their implementation. The EP Group expects that the upcoming Vilnius and Washington summits pave the way to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO, and that the accession process will start after the war is over and be finalized as soon as possible. This will strengthen our alliance and be a further step towards sustainable peace in Europe. According to Euractiv, a Europe-wide media group, NATO might end up just offering to upgrade the current status of the relationship with Ukraine by setting up an enhanced version of the current Ukraine-NATO Council. European Pravda claims that, under the plan, Ukraine would be a full-fledged member around the Ukraine NATO Council table instead of being only invited for discussions, as is the case now. Kiev could then call for meetings when they wish, and it would be easier to give a direct update on the situation on the battlefield. Those could include more intelligence sharing and consultations, joint exercises, investment in the defense industry, and work on the interoperability between Ukraine's and the NATO member states' armed forces, giving Kiev the option to align with NATO's communiques and standards. There are different views in the alliance on this issue as well. Consultations are ongoing as consensus is needed to move forward. Even Ukraine, however, acknowledges that it is unlikely to become a member state until after the war ends. At the same time, it is actively promoting its need for security guarantees until membership has been achieved. It is looking to both guarantees currently applied to Sweden, which is waiting for Turkey and Hungary to accept its membership application, and Israel. Ultimately, no solutions than NATO membership itself provide better security guarantees. Still, it's important to ask the question, what would happen if, hypothetically, NATO declares Ukraine a member a couple of weeks after the NATO summit? Some fear an escalation of the war into a broader confrontation that has in reality already been ongoing for years. Some oppose it out of fear, believing that an accession of Ukraine into NATO would trigger a nuclear confrontation leading to why we. Others seek a political solution which could appease the aggressor, despite the failure of such an approach over more than 9 years. Some simply believe it runs counter to their own national interests. None of the above, however, changes the fact that without Ukraine, there is no sustainable European security architecture. NATO will not be able to defend the security and stability of its member states without Ukraine. The alliance's prerequisite that new membership candidates cannot have any unresolved border disputes with their neighboring countries prevents a crucially important debate. The starting point of such a debate might, therefore, be just: does the precondition serve its purpose when it triggers wars and conflicts along NATO's external borders? The prerequisite was introduced by NATO and can, therefore, be removed by NATO? It can be done if the member states find it in their common national interest to withdraw it. Removing it does not mean all applicants automatically become eligible for membership. The alliance would still have to consider each application individually. Its removal, however, would allow for the accession process to start, without necessarily changing the outcome. I believe that the ongoing broader confrontation, including the war in Ukraine, is a testimony to the failure of diplomacy. I have previously argued that a Ukrainian NATO accession, which in essence would be the ultimate diplomatic outcome in the present security situation, might help end the war. As one expert framed it, Ukrainian membership of NATO would constitute a Russian defeat. Some of the arguments in favor of its immediate NATO accession are: the West is already a party to the war, not only because of Russia's stated foreign strategy aims and objectives, its threat assessments, its military doctrine and concepts supporting its strategic aim and objectives, and its hybrid war against the West, but also its inherent imperialistic nature. The EU has already recognized that its member states, most of which are also NATO members, are exposed to a Russian hybrid war. Acknowledging the conflict and the threat would force NATO to act upon the transgression. It would be the first step in forcing Russia to withdraw. Russia does not want to fight the alliance. It has done its utmost to limit Western support for Ukraine and, not least, avoid a military confrontation with NATO. It succeeded in stopping the US and Europe from helping to rebuild Ukrainian deterrence during the previous 8 years. Since Feb 24, 2022, its previous and ongoing efforts to shape the minds of both populations, as well as key policy and decision makers in the West, has resulted in a slow and incremental inflow of weapons and ammunition. The West is still struggling to pass the two last mental hurdles: executing a military intervention according to its late strategic concept, and the UN responsible to protect doctrine, and accepting Ukraine as a NATO member. Despite Russia's information and influence operations, backed by its belligerent and outright threatening strategic messaging, Russia has in fact been trying to avoid a military confrontation over fear of being defeated. NATO members are already defending themselves in Ukraine. Eastern Europe has been advocating for NATO to act according to its previous strategic concept for years. Failing to achieve consensus, they have still bilaterally acted according to the concept by providing Ukraine with what it needs at an unprecedented scale and scope. Additionally, most NATO members have long acknowledged that Ukraine is defending European security and stability as well as its shared values and principles. It is our fight to fight, and we should be defending our shared values and principles shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian soldiers. It could end the war. A simple diplomatic declaration of Ukraine's NATO membership would fundamentally change the military balance without firing a shot. By making Ukraine a fully integrated member of the alliance, NATO becomes an official party to the war on the date of accession. It would mean that if Russia continued attacking Ukraine after its accession into NATO, it would trigger collective defense according to Article 5. It is a NATO fait accompli. Accept it, or accept the consequences of continuing the war. It provides a clear and non-negotiable red line. As previously argued, it would also offer Putin an off-ramp. Russia will never accept being defeated by Ukraine. A nation it alleges does not exist, but it would accept a strategic withdrawal when facing the world's strongest military alliance. Some would argue that this would trigger war. In my opinion, given the sorrowful state of the Russian armed forces and its role as the aggressor, it would present Russia with a small dilemma. Does it want to fight the collective might of us in Europe? Or would it prefer to withdraw its remaining military and security forces to secure its own internationally recognized borders? Russia does not possess the means to escalate a war in which it has already lost the military initiative, where it is increasingly forced to deploy antique weapon systems and poorly trained, demotivated, mobilized personnel. I have previously argued why a nuclear confrontation is extremely unlikely. I have also argued, however, why a failure to stop and evict Russia from Ukraine will lead to further aggression. The West either stops Russia in Ukraine today or accepts the risks that the military confrontation will spread further tomorrow. Will NATO declare Ukraine a member state at the NATO summit? It doesn't seem likely. It should, however, not stop us from calling for just that. Present Russia with a fait accompli by accepting Ukraine as a NATO member at Vilnius. Ensure a Russian defeat through that one. Simple diplomatic decision. And Moldova, Zelensky presses NATO bid. Seeks interim guarantees. President Volodymyr Zelensky pressed his case on Thursday for Ukraine to be part of the NATO military alliance and urged the alliance to provide security guarantees if membership was not possible for now. Joining a meeting of European leaders in Moldova, the Ukrainian leader was seeking to bolster Western support ahead of his country's expected counter-offensive against Russia's invasion. France and Germany both expressed support for the concept of security guarantees. Addressing leaders at the start of the gathering, Zelensky asked NATO members to take a clear decision on whether to admit Ukraine and also reiterated calls for Western fighter jets to protect Ukrainian skies after another deadly strike on Kyiv, as well as providing Patriot missile defense systems. Noting that the F-16 fighter jets he is seeking are supplied by the U.S., Zelensky said after the meeting he had heard powerful support from many countries, adding, "With help of the United States, we will create this coalition." Last month, U.S. President Joe Biden endorsed training programs for Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, although such programs will take months to complete and Western countries have not yet said they will supply the jets. Until Ukraine had fighter jets, Russia would continue to have air supremacy, Zelensky said, highlighting the importance of having more Patriot air defenses in the immediate term. At the start of the summit, grouping the EU's 27 member states and 20 other European states, Zelensky said he would seek a clear invitation from NATO for Ukraine to join at the alliance's summit in Vilnius in mid-July. He said later that Ukraine sought future security guarantees if NATO membership was not possible for now, while insisting that the best security guarantee was membership. French President Emmanuel Macron said Ukraine needed to be given clear and strong security guarantees at the NATO summit in July. Macron said he was working closely with Germany on the issue with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz next week. We have to give a long-term perspective to Ukraine. It is imperative that the Vilnius summit gives these immediate guarantees, he said. Scholz said such guarantees must be designed in such a way that they give Ukraine the security it needs against the danger of being attacked, that they also stabilize Ukraine at the same time, which of course also means a commitment with regard to the establishment of defense capability on the part of Ukraine. There have been divisions between NATO members over the speed of Ukraine's accession, with some fearing that a hasty move could bring the alliance closer to direct confrontation with Russia. Moldovan President Maia Sandu hosted the summit at a castle just 20 km, 12 miles, from Ukrainian territory and near the Russian-backed breakaway Transnistria region of Moldova. We told President Zelensky that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, she told a news conference closing the gathering. EU aspirations. Zelensky also said Ukraine was working towards holding a summit to discuss parameters for ending the war, but had not set a date yet, as Kyiv wanted to bring more countries to the table. Leaders used Thursday's meeting as a symbolic show of support for Ukraine and Moldova, while also tackling other issues, including a rise in ethnic tensions in Kosovo and efforts towards lasting peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The summit was a security and organizational challenge for Moldova, an ex-Soviet republic of 2.5 million people that is seeking a path to EU accession while being wary of Russia. Sandu, a pro-Western leader whose relations with Moscow became severely strained after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year, was using the summit to push for talks to make Moldova's EU entry as fast as possible. Like Ukraine, it applied to join the EU last year shortly after the Russian invasion. Diplomatic sources said a speech from Macron in Bratislava on Wednesday, in which he called for EU enlargement as quickly as possible, was a signal that Paris, once hesitant, would back EU membership talks for Ukraine and Moldova to start at the end of the year. Kosovo tensions. The EU also sought to use the gathering to tackle tensions in northern Kosovo between the ruling ethnic Albanian majority and minority Serbs, which have flared into violence in recent days, prompting NATO to deploy 700 more peacekeepers there. Macron said France and Germany urged the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia to organize new elections as soon as possible in regions affected by civil unrest. Kosovo President Vjosa Osmani said her country was ready to hold new local elections in the crisis. Hit north as long as they were triggered by a legal process. Osmani made the comments to reporters after meeting with Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell on the sidelines of the summit. The summit was the second meeting of the European political community, a brainchild of Macron. It provided an opportunity to address other regional frictions, including between Azerbaijan and Armenia, whose leaders were expected to hold talks with Macron, Scholz, and EU officials, and reinforce cooperation between EU officials, and reinforce cooperation between EU members and non-EU members on cybersecurity, misinformation, and connectivity.